Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Today we have a very special episode with a very special friend of the Remnant. I don't know what number time this is for Tevi Troy, but given that he always comes on at least when he has a new book out, it's got to be the 40th or 50th appearance. Tevi is got a new book coming out. The pub date isn't for a little bit, but I've been assured that we will get in no trouble for having this conversation now. But just so you know, we are recording this a little while ago. Normally we record and basically release the next day. This was recorded for your time living on a planet with intelligent apes ruling the planet would be called last week. So if it's a little dated on any stray punditry we wander into, it's for that reason. But Tevi Troy, my friend, literally my oldest friend in Washington, who I replaced at the American Enterprise Institute in 1991-ish, 92-ish, something like that. Author of many books, the latest of which is The Power and the Money: The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. Tevi Troy, welcome back to the Remnant. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about The Power and the Money and being able to talk about a book without you accusing me of driving all the conversation to the book. So
yes, that's
right.
It's
legit.
That's right. This is one of those opportunities where shameless plugging of your book is allowed because it's a feature, not a bug.
Not allowed, required, I believe.
That's right. So in the grand tradition of this podcast, what's your book about?
Well, I knew this question was coming, so I'm very excited about it. This book really is the culmination of conversations that you and I have been having over 30 years about my whole career in Washington, my work in government. It's really about the clashes between CEOs and presidents who are each representatives of the big entities that drive our lives today, big business and big government. And so I go back in time, I start with Rockefeller and JP Morgan, and I look at these people who created corporations and industries at a time when, there was nothing on the corporate side. These things didn't exist at the time. They made the oil industry, they made these big banking institutions. But at the same time, government had no weapons or tools with which to deal with them. And over the last 150 years that I described in the book, we have both the development of massive corporations that now employ something like 30 million people and also bring in something like $400 trillion annually in revenue. So these are massive, massive entities, but they also can be constrained by a massive federal government that has over 2 million employees and hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations. And that wasn't always the case. So the book is really a history of America over the last 150 years as these two institutions have developed that did not exist beforehand. And the clashes between the presidents and the CEOs is the lens through which I tell the story.
All right, so why don't we start with that? The first chapter is called The Blank Slate. You have these little sort of subtitles to the chapters telling you what's in the chapter. I fear that you've given over to the cult of smart brevity for the sake of the CEOs who expect this kind of thing. But the presidents contained in this chapter are Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, Chester A. Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley. There were other presidents that did the dance in The Simpsons of the animatronic 19th century presidents that people forget their names. But and the CEOs mentioned are John D. Rockefeller and JP Morgan. So in the before times, before the rise of the deep state and all of that kind of stuff, what was the principal relationship between big businessmen and government?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me just address that issue you talk about with the smart brevity. What I intentionally do at the start of each chapter is I list the presidents and the CEOs who are mentioned in that chapter, but CEOs and or presidents who make it to subsequent chapters, I only give their last name to show that they've been mentioned before, to show that there's some continuity. And when I was coming up with who gets profiled in this book, because obviously there's a lot of big name CEOs of the last 150 years, it's only CEOs who both were somewhat iconic, meaning they were famous, well-known, but also they had ongoing relationships with multiple presidents. So if you're a CEO for a 4-year period and only had a relationship with one president, you weren't making this book. I needed to be able to compare and contrast your relationship with multiple presidents to give some insight into what strategies work and what strategies don't. So that was the first thing. The second thing, in terms of your question about the blank slate, is, as I said, government had very few tools for dealing with business or big business at the time. I'm not saying that as a good thing or as a bad thing. I mean, we have this regulatory state that's developed over the last 150 years. I think there's probably too little regulation in 1870, and I definitely think there's too much regulation today in 2024 when we intelligent apes are still bravely roaming over the planet. And so when Rockefeller is building this empire, and he does build an empire really in the period from 1870 to 1880, and by the end of it, his company Standard Oil, which is named because they create a standard by which you could trust their oil. There was lots of shady oil operators at the time, and they came up with unreliable or unstable oil. So what Rockefeller was doing with the name Standard was saying, here, there is a standard, which is kind of what the FDA or any regulatory body tries to do today, to say there's some standard for these products you're getting. Rockefeller is trying to do that on the corporate side, not on the government side. And again, because government didn't really exist to do those things. So Rockefeller builds this empire. Some presidents were starting to notice him. Ulysses S. Grant makes some comment about the trusts. And but they also noticed that this guy has a lot of money. And so in 1880, James A. Garfield is running for president, and he notes that there's this guy named Rockefeller. He misspells the name. He doesn't know how it's pronounced. He doesn't really know who he is. And he says he seems to have a lot of money, and he asked his political advisor, a guy named Amos Townsend, about maybe getting money from this guy. And Townsend warns him that the name Rockefeller cuts like a knife in Pennsylvania. Again, we're looking at this election, and Pennsylvania, extremely important. Back then, it was pretty important too. And he warns him to stay away from Rockefeller because any association with Rockefeller would be politically damaged. Now, that doesn't mean Rockefeller didn't give money to the Garfield campaign. He ended up doing it. But even back then, 150 years ago, there was a recognition by politicians that I guess we can get money from these CEO guys, but maybe we shouldn't get too close to them because it could have politically deleterious effects on our political prospects.
It's just some quick cleanup work here. Clarification work, I should say. The term CEO, they didn't use the term CEO back then, right? I mean, this is CEO, I mean, has a weird etymology. I looked it up. But we're just using that as a stand-in for titans of industry, leaders of men, presidents or owners of big firms, right?
That's correct. And not everyone in my book had the title CEO, which is a title that now, if you're head of a big corporation, you would have. But back then, it was always the case.
So it's weird. It's like, it's not necessarily, it shouldn't necessarily be capitalized because you're actually using it descriptively, at least back then. These were the chief executive officers of these companies, but it's not a title when you just basically own the thing. Second of all, what? I should know a little bit about this, but were there any campaign finance rules in the 19th century? I mean, if John D. Rockefeller wanted to give a president a bajillion dollars under the table, or presidential candidate, were there any rules governing this in one way or another?
It's not necessarily under the table. I mean, I put out in the book that Morgan gives as much money to the Republican candidate in one election as the Democrats had total. Right? I mean, it was almost equivalent numbers. And so, yeah, you can give a lot of money, but there are also warnings. You could have politically problematic pushback if you got too much money from a CEO, and people would call him out on it. And in fact, in one election, I talk about how Roosevelt gets a donation from Standard Oil. This is in 1904. And they kind of say to Roosevelt, the corporate execs, Rockefeller had never retired, but the corporate execs say, hey, we're going to give you this money. We kind of don't want you to spurn us and embarrass us and make this a problem. You have to recognize where the money is coming from. And the Roosevelt didn't say, yeah, sure, we get it. And then, of course, it comes out in the newspapers, so just Pulitzer's papers make a big deal about this donation from Standard Oil, and then Roosevelt makes a big deal about giving the money back. It's not even clear he gave the money back, but he embarrassed Standard Oil by saying.
But my point about putting it under the table, giving it under the table, is that there could be an incentive to say, hey, look, we're going to give you a ton of money, but like the return on the ROI on why we're giving you money isn't the publicity. We don't think that helps anybody. We want X policy or Y policy or railroad through this place and not through that place. Did you have to disclose? Did it have to, could you, presumably you could just, not everybody's going to be Teddy Roosevelt, right? The incentives could be I don't want to be seen taking money from Standard Oil, and you don't want to be seen giving money to me, but it's in our interest for you to give me money, and it's your interest for me to do what you want me to do. So, could you just do big stuff behind the scenes?
Yes, you could, and that's something that I think comes out a couple of times in the book, where you do have these big donations, and it could be a little bit problematic, but we don't have the campaign finance laws that we do today.
So, as you know, in my first book, I spent a lot of time toiling with the progressive era, and I've spent a lot of time I've returned to it many, many times, right? And one of my great peeves is that I've had to become, and this is one of the guys I recommended that you read, was Gabriel Kolko, who was essentially a Marxist historian, but a good historian. This is something that there are some people who have problems understanding, is that you can be a good historian, also a Marxist. Just means you should engage the text critically from time to time. But the story that we were told in high school was that courageous muckraking journalists and authors like Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle and that kind of thing, they brought public attention and shame upon big business, and that's what led to an era of reforms that big businesses fought tooth and nail. That story is not true, is it?
There's some truth to it, but Teddy Roosevelt, and I talk about this in the book, Roosevelt was very good at, he would find these authors like Sinclair, he would read their works, and then he would use them to make the point that he was trying to make. So Roosevelt wanted to go after the trusts. He wanted to go after Standard Oil. He wanted to have some kind of nascent Food and Drug Administration. And it was just helpful to him that you had Upton Sinclair talking about the meat industry, or in my book, we talk about Ida Tarbell and how she goes after Standard Oil. Roosevelt didn't like Standard Oil before the famous feature by Ida Tarbell that really blisters Standard Oil, but he sure knew how to take advantage of it. And so I think that's the more accurate story. And then I do appreciate talking to you in advance, and this is something we can talk about later, about reaching out to smart people before you write the book and getting insights, as opposed to dropping 100,000 words on a friend of yours and say, give me insights. Or sure, they're going to correct the split infinitives, and they don't necessarily direct where the book is going to go to the same extent. But you pointed out, Polko, and look, these corporations, they saw benefits in being regulated. And my favorite story on this from the book is that when Standard Oil is broken up, it happens after Roosevelt's no longer president and after Rockefeller is no longer CEO. Rockefeller hears about this, that the Supreme Court has agreed to break up Standard Oil. He hears about it on the golf course. He's playing with a priest. And he says to the priest 3 words: buy Standard Oil. So even after the most grievous regulatory blow that the United States government has ever dropped on any corporation happens, Rockefeller recognizes that this is actually good for shareholders of Standard Oil, and there's more money to be made. And there was, because when Standard Oil is broken up, what is it broken up into? Exxon and Mobil and Chevron and a whole bunch of other energy companies that we know still today. And if you had bought Standard Oil stock on the day of that Supreme Court breakup, you would have made a mint, and Rockefeller recognized that. So I think a lot of these companies recognize that regulation is good because it creates barriers to entry. And there's this guy on this podcast, The Remnant, who's always saying complexity is a subsidy, and he's right. Complexity is a subsidy, and it helps these big corporations. And so I think the overall message of the power of the money, in addition to being a fascinating history of these individual fights between presidents and CEOs, is that government, as it fills the blank space and as it creates more regulation and more regulatory bodies, it doesn't prohibit companies from making a profit. Indeed, they make vast profits, but it does increasingly direct the way in which companies do it, and it shapes how companies go about it, and it uses it for advancing government's social ends. And so what we see over this 150-year period is this increased enmeshment of big business and big government. For big business, they make big profits, but they also get the benefit of keeping smaller competitors out to a large extent. And they also are doing government's ends, and they have to take that into account. That's why a new CEO, freshly minted, first day, needs to say, what are we doing with Washington? How are we engaging with Washington? How are we making sure that Washington will help us grow our business and not destroy it?
Right. I mean, like U.S. Steel actually at one point lobbied for the socialization of what they called the socialization of the steel industry, because basically what it meant was basically turning U.S. Steel into the steel monopoly, the utility for steel or something like that in America, where, it's sort of what the phone company was for a very long time, right? Is that just basically the government says you are free from competition from other people, and you can still take rents and skim a profit off of these things. And without competition, profit is kind of awesome.
Yeah. If you had purchased stock in an index fund of just health insurance stocks on the day Obamacare passed, you would have made a ton of money.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily how people thought about it at the time. And it certainly wasn't the rhetoric of the people who were pushing Obamacare said. But that is what has happened. And you're going to make a lot of money by buying insurance stocks from that day.
So, I mean, all right. So, anyway, I don't want to talk my priors and make my case about how big business and big government are more in bed and tend to be pushed into bed together by progressive reformers, because as I used to put it, when the government hugs a business hugs back, right? And they get sort of and public choice theory is a thing, right? But where were in the progressive era, where were big business and the president and the White House truly at odds and fought the most intensively, or was it always this sort of weird dance where everybody gets something out of it?
It's hard to say big business because you have different people who take different approaches. So let's take the 1930s and the or you want to go back further in time, but let's do the 1930s, because
Sure.
you've got this nice contrast between Henry Ford, who runs Ford, the motor company, and he can't stand the New Deal and doesn't want to have what he calls the that buzzard, meaning the blue eagle that shows the kind of approbation of government from the National Recovery Act. He doesn't want that on his businesses. And at the same time, you have the Warner Brothers, who are hugging Franklin Roosevelt and trying to get propaganda movies made that will advance the interests of Franklin Roosevelt. So different companies take different approaches to dealing with government. And sometimes, as I show in the book, in The Power of Money, that a lot of it has to do with the personalities. Right? Ford, I guess, could have benefited from partnering more closely with government. And in the end, when World War II happens, he does build a huge armaments plant and creates the biggest armaments plant at Willow Run that Franklin Roosevelt even visits, despite the enmity between the two of them. But he just doesn't like the New Deal, and he makes no bones about it. And then Roosevelt and his minions criticize Ford. Harold Hickes is the designated attack dog against corporations for Roosevelt and his political apparatus, and he goes after Ford. And it's clearly at Roosevelt's direction. So again, different companies take different approaches, but the companies that are really, I would say, strategic and not necessarily doing this based on personality or personal dislikes, those ones are saying, maybe we can work with this big government thing because it gives us an advantage over the small companies who are trying to make it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the New Deal. Unless you want to go back to Teddy Roosevelt or that other president, who I don't have positive feelings towards. Actually, let's go back to Woodrow Wilson for a second. and yes, I know we don't do the orc scream every single time we mention them anymore because, I only have so much power at this institution that I co-founded. But, so, because I think this is one of the things that people don't appreciate enough is that the New Deal really was in many ways an extension of what happened under Woodrow Wilson, right? And that a lot of the New Deal programs were really updatings on what the war socialism of Woodrow Wilson, the War Industries Board, and all that kind of thing. And that's when you got what were they called, dollar a year men, who were like these businessmen who went into government claiming to take only a salary of $1 a year because they were so patriotic. But this is one of the places where I love the overlap in the Venn diagram between Marxist historians and libertarian historians, because they both make the exact same points. That setup actually was beneficial to a lot of businesses because, even if you're not taking a big salary, you're sending contracts to your businesses and to your friends and whatnot. What were actually like Wilson's views of big business, and of what were his relationships with CEOs?
Well, Wilson did have a relationship with Henry Ford. I talk about it in the book, but it's more about the war in World War I. Henry Ford comes to visit Wilson to ask and beg him not to have the U.S. enter World War I. Henry Ford was a massive pacifist. He thought, he read some article when he was a kid that said that the actual word for soldier is murderer. And that really affected him. So anyway, he goes to see Wilson in the White House, and I love the story. He kind of warms Wilson up by telling him Henry Ford jokes. Henry Ford jokes were a big thing in the 1910s and 20s. There were even Henry Ford joke books. And so he tries to warm up Wilson, and Wilson, as we know, is a prick, and even he laughs at one of the jokes. But then he doesn't really have much interest in Ford's argument about keeping the U.S. out of World War I, so he doesn't really take business insights that seriously, and he ends up having Ford escorted out of the White House because Ford's being annoyed, which I kind of love. And then Ford goes and creates this thing called a peace ship, where he takes a bunch of lefty celebrities and they go to Europe and they try and prevent the war from expanding, obviously, and doing good because the war continued for a long time. A lot more people since that. I mean, even Ford's wife tells him to get out of this peace ship deal because it's so embarrassing. So that's one thing. But then he maintains a relationship with Ford, and he even encourages Ford to run for Senate. Ford fails, and there's also some great stuff in the book because Thomas Edison, who is a mentor and close friend of Ford, berates him for trying to be involved in politics because he correctly notes that Ford has no ability to do public speaking. And he says, you're practically mute. So why do you want to go do that? So I think there's some relations, but it's not as overarching as we have it in the New Deal when you have the Blue Eagle that has to go and be affixed on every business if they want to get the approval. I just think government got bigger, more overweening, more, I call it quasi-fascistic in the book. And I took that in part from your writing. So when you say dealing with your priors, I mean, your thinking and our conversations of the year have informed how I approached this book. But, one of my readers didn't like the quasi-fascistic designation on the Blue Eagle and the national recovery. But I think it's fair. I mean, the government's saying we're okay with this business and we're not okay with that business. So that gets kind of creepy. And so I think the New Deal very much was an extension of what was going on with the rest of America. But government just had more power and more ability to do those things, in large part because of the collapse of 1929 and the creation of the Great Depression. People were looking for government to do more, and it sure did.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is for your book, not for mine, but there are a great number of far less radioactive and far more esteemed historians than I, who made comparisons between what was going on with the NRA and what was going on in Germany and in Italy. I mean, Rexford Tugwell pointed out the similarities. Charles Beard pointed out the similarities in real time. Wolfgang Schiffelbusch, German historian, has a book called The Three New Deals, which can get into some of that stuff. So, and if I were to describe some of the excesses of the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration, which was the progenitor of the Blue Eagle, if I were to describe them without any cultural identifiers of the country I was describing, most normal people would say that sounds kind of fashy. But
And Hugh Johnson was the head of it,
right.
and goes out, and they was talking about this in the book. He goes out and he threatens Ford. So yeah, there was a creepy side to it, and I don't mean to say that you were the only person who came up with this comparison.
No, I'm trying to defend you in case you
right.
think, in case listeners think, oh, he's been Jedi mind tricked by Jonah. It's like, no, they're like very serious people who've made these points. FDR reviewed Mussolini's book and said, hey, this guy's onto something. You know, I mean, like there's a historical case here.
Right, and there's this point I've made to you many times over the years that your first and excellent book about liberal fascism was really your graduate education. I mean, you did such a deep dive; it was very impressive, and so I learned a lot from looking at all the sources that you used in developing that book.
Well, we're not
Did
going
you
to
do that Frank Fukuyama thing where you just read the first 8 pages and say you got enough?
No, I mean, I actually do want to read the whole book, and I did ultimately read the whole Fukuyama book, but what listeners may not know is that Tevi was in my first job interview at AAI, and the guy I was looking to work for, Ben Wattenberg, asked me what the last book I read, and that was, and I lied and said Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, and which I barely just started. And he was like, I never understood what that book is about, and I explained it well enough that Tevi didn't burst out laughing, and Ben was like, oh, okay. And
then Jonah told me as we were leaving the interview that he had only gotten up that far to page 8 thus far. So I was very, very impressed because it was a pitch perfect description of the book.
This is why, as we learned from the movie Metropolitan, it's so vital to read reviews rather than books. Anyway,
I don't read literature; I read literary criticism.
All right. So, what is your favorite story from the book, The Power and the Money? Did you to it? About FDR's relationship with big business or with CEOs.
I just love that FDR has this full-on hate relationship with Henry Luce for all these years. And Henry Luce is trying to get all his magazines, and they're big and important, Time and Fortune, and he's constantly using them to attack Roosevelt. And it really matters not a whit to Roosevelt in a way. And Roosevelt, I guess, gets his ultimate revenge when Henry Luce wants to go visit Asia during World War II. Roosevelt comes up with this crackpot rule that just says publishers can't visit war zones or something like that. And it's directed basically at Henry Luce. And Luce can't go to the war zone until Roosevelt dies. And then Truman, when he becomes president, allows Luce to make the visit. But Luce just hated Roosevelt so much, he said at one point, it is my duty to go on hating him. But again, I think in this one of the key lessons of the book, you can hate the president if you're a CEO, but ultimately the president has the power. And I think National Review, in its review of the book, which I think was insightful, said that in any one relationship, the president has the edge. But what the CEOs have, and this is why it shows the CEOs that chose, they have staying power. So they could outlast one administration, and indeed, Luce outlasts the Roosevelt administration, and Truman allows him to do what he wants.
Which is saying something, given that Roosevelt was essentially president for life. No, this outlasting thing, I think, so it's funny. It's like I'm trying to think about like some of the lessons from all of this, and one of the ones that sort of comes to mind is that, so I'm a big opponent of corporatism, which we can return to as a concept, but this is basically the economic doctrine of fascism is corporatism, which does not mean rule by corporations. It goes back to Catholic social thought and this idea that all the stakeholders sit around the table in cooperation. And so in medieval times it would be guilds, the aristocracy, the church, right? It's the major power centers. And that was stable as a means of social organization for a very long time because you did not have capitalism. And And the through line for me of the Wilson years with the parentheses under the sainted Calvin Coolidge, and then the New Deal era, is that both the New Deal and Wilson's War of Socialism were essentially corporatist. They wanted to get the big businessmen around the table, get buy-in, cartelize a lot of the industry, right? And when all the major players are inside the tent, you can make decisions about how to organize political economy and screw the little guy. And one of the things that seems to mitigate against that is robust economic growth. When there are new players, new entrants into the scene who have an interest in not allowing the incumbents to define how the political economy works. And you can get a sort of a chicken or the egg thing where the less economic growth you have, the more the incumbents acquire power, create barriers to entry, and that in turn breeds more stagnation, which lets them stay incumbents. This is sort of what happened in Venezuela. It's what happened in a lot of places, right? And the political impulse for a lot of presidents, it seems to me, is to encourage that process a little bit. And I mean, you saw this a lot more up close with Obamacare stuff than I did, but like, if you can co-opt the biggest players, then you have an incentive in keeping them the biggest players because they're on your team. And that was a big chunk, I think, of what the political impulses were for FDR and the New Deal, was to sort of say, okay, these big units, they're with us, and we're going to freeze out smaller units. We're going to stop with the chaotic capitalism of the 19th century or the 1920s. And we're going to get the big players all inside a room, and we're going to decide how to run the country.
Yeah, and I think a lesson here is that people don't like chaos. And whether it's John D. Rockefeller trying to reduce chaos in the oil industry by creating, again, the Standard Oil, or you've got what's happening today with all these tech stocks. Right? I mean, these are companies that didn't exist 25 years ago, and now they're the biggest players in the S&P 500, and they recognized pretty quickly that you needed to work closely with government. In fact, one of the lessons I have in the book is Bill Gates, who tried to do the Rockefeller strategy and just have Microsoft grow and get bigger than government. He eventually got burned by it as the Clinton administration antitrust division goes after him. And he leaves Microsoft at a point when there was an unfavorable ruling towards them. And I speculate in the book, and speculation at the time, that they're not unrelated. But when he meets a young Mark Zuckerberg, who's a real Bill Gates fanboy, they both dropped out of Harvard, they both had this interest in computers from a young age, they both built these massive tech companies. Gates tells Zuckerberg, get an office there now. And there means Washington, D.C.
Right.
And Facebook listened. And Facebook, we both know Joel Kaplan. Joel is the head of the Facebook Washington office, and it's quite a formidable operation. It doesn't mean everybody likes Facebook, that as it's called out. It's a lot of critics on both sides of the aisle. But Zuckerberg sure listened and built a big operation.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of one part of my point about, like, when you hug business, business hugs back, right? Is that if you put the squeeze on big business, the more you have a system that says your profit margins and your bottom line are contingent upon decision makers in Washington rather than on consumers, the more you're going to gear your company's operations towards caring about Washington. And that means you're going to try to protect your company by getting involved in politics. And that's the vicious cycle of the politicization of the economy, is you have the big business sort of reaching its, when Uncle Sam reaches its grubby hands into big business reaches its grubby hands into politics more. And you want to keep them apart rather than, get everybody working together.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in the book, I talk about Jamie Dimon, the banking CEO, and how he initially was coming to Washington twice a year, and he realized that wasn't enough, and he changed things, and he said he's going to come to Washington twice a month. Just think about it. He's the CEO of this massive financial institution, and he thinks one of the most important things to do is make sure that he's in Washington twice every month. And so whenever some new player comes, whether it's on the Democratic or Republican side, making a big job at SEC or at Treasury, he knows that because he's spending the time here.
I feel ashamed, dirty, corrupt for having skipped over Calvin Coolidge, praise be his name. Calvin Coolidge is one of the opening sort of epigram quotes you have at the beginning of the book about, and you quote it correctly, which I'm glad to see, where Coolidge says the chief business of America is business. It's not the business of America's business, right? And given the sort of treatment of Coolidge, and I guess we should talk about Hoover as well. Um, what was Coolidge's relationship with CEOs and big business? And this is a leading question. How different was it than Hoover's?
Yeah, that is a issue. So first of all, I would say that Coolidge and Hoover are relatively more minor characters in the book because they don't have any clashes with big CEOs.
Yeah.
Coolidge comes up because, first of all, Henry Ford is thinking of running for president in 1924 post Harding, and then when Coolidge takes over after Harding's surprising death, it's only about 57, 58 at the time, dies mysteriously of a heart attack. That kind of ends the Henry Ford for president boom list, so that's one way he comes up. And then also Coolidge kind of does these vacations with Henry Ford, because Henry Ford has these guys called the vagabonds, and they go around the country. One of them is Thomas Edison, and they film their vacations, and sometimes they would bring presidents to their vacation spots, which was a good photo op for presidents. So Harding does this, and also Coolidge does it. But again, you don't have these big clashes. And then Hoover comes out mostly because he's desperate to keep the economy propped up by the time when it's collapsing, and he has some people, even like an aged John D. Rockefeller, who are trying to say good things, positive things about the economy at a time when things are getting pretty bad. So again, you have to be a more activist president to have these the bigger fights with the CEO.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. Like, one of the things I really struggled with this period was trying to figure out what constituted right wing. Like, people tell me, oh, you got to read the old right, you got to read this, you got to read that. And I couldn't find a real conception. In like pre-New Deal America, it's one thing, it's the superfluous men and curmudgeons and Mencken and that kind of thing. And then in the 1930s, it very quickly dawns on me that it just basically means opponent of Roosevelt. And the ideological content or the interests you were representing didn't really matter. You were just simply called right wing if you had problems with FDR, which meant that the ideological spectrum of right wingers was really kind of just, I mean, it was a dog's breakfast of weirdos and businessmen and free marketers and socialists who attacked them from the left. And there was no coherent thing other than it's very similar in a way to sort of how Donald Trump has redefined what it means to be where you are on the political spectrum. It's like, are you pro-Trump or anti-Trump? Answers all sorts of questions it shouldn't answer. It's like, if you were pro FDR, you were mainstream or left-wing or liberal or progressive or whatever. And if you were anti-FDR for whatever reason, you were kind of right. That's what made you a right-winger, which is just a really weird. I'm being simplistic because communism had something to do with all this stuff too, but we can put that to the side. But it's just once you get that, it answers a lot of questions, not all of them, but it helps you sort of understand how really transformative the New Deal era was.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. But there's one other aspect that I think remnant listeners will appreciate, which is all this happens before William F. Buckley, praise be his name, and his attempt to define conservatism. And then
Right.
later we talk about fusionism, and that comes up a lot on this podcast, as it should. And so if you don't have any arbiters of what conservatism is, it just becomes anything that's not Roosevelt. It's just someone like Father Coughlin, who I don't think in any conservative ideas as we would interpret them today. Well, I was also raging anti-Semite. We still talk about the right-wing priest, Father Coughlin, and I don't think it's at all fair to call him right-wing or accurate. So I do think that sometimes we have these political figures, and I think Trump's now been on the political scene enough that he's sort of the defining figure of the early 21st century. And it is true that the definition of where you are is whether you're pro-Trump or anti.
So surely you were not going to say anything untoward about Dwight Eisenhower.
I am not critical of Eisenhower per se, but I do talk about Henry Luce.
Uh-huh.
And Luce, and I think this is a really interesting contrast in the book. And I mentioned earlier that Luce hated Roosevelt and uses the power of his magazines against Roosevelt to little effect.
Right. We should explain,
But then,
give a picture of how big a media empire Luce had for.
so in 1923, Henry Luce creates this thing called Time magazine. There was no national news before that. Luce had this idea that I'm going to create a news magazine for the entire country, and we now have the technology to do it in rapid printing presses and faster distribution mechanisms. And so he creates this thing called Time magazine, and it becomes a massive phenomenon. Tens of millions of readers. Everybody reads it. He also, and this is important for people like me, presidential historians, he starts to focus on the presidency. What did the president eat? What did the president say? What movie did the president watch? So stuff that really helps me with the developing and learning presidential trivia. A lot of that comes from Luce and his interest in this subject and recognition of the American people first. He builds this massive media empire. Interestingly, a lot of the writers are big left-wingers.
Right.
But Luce says, it's my magazine and it's going to say what I want it to say. He uses the magazine to criticize Roosevelt relentlessly, which kind of irks many liberal writers, but where else are they going to go, I guess, because there weren't that many jobs, certainly not jobs as lucrative for writers. But then when Eisenhower comes around, Luce takes a different approach and he becomes completely supportive of Eisenhower, so much so that people see Time as a magazine that's in the tank for Eisenhower. And there's a joke that someone paraphrasing, but it's in the appendix of the book where I list all the great jokes, that Time was even-handed. Half the time it praised the Republicans, the other half the time it blasted the Democrats. So there's this sense among the smart set in the 50s that, this Time magazine, we used to look to it, but now it's hopelessly middle brow and hopelessly pro-Republican. And Time really suffers a reputational blow as a result of Luce's overly strong support of Eisenhower. And so I argue that if you're a CEO going too hard against a president, like Luce did against Roosevelt, can be a problematic strategy. But being too much in the tank for any one president, like Luce was with Eisenhower, is a weakness as well.
Yeah, I was the ludicrous of all of that is that, first of all, denouncing Ike is kind of stupid. But second of all, the Democrats desperately wanted Ike to run for president as a Democrat. It just turns out that, in successfully invading Europe and being a sort of a competent, nice guy in the process is really appealing to a lot of people. We don't have that much more time, and I want to give you an opportunity. So, of the presidents and CEOs that we have left post Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, where do you want to go next?
Well, obviously, I love Ronald Reagan, as do you, and I think there's some interesting stuff with Reagan, including with Lee Iacocca, whom I trace in the book as having this very strange trajectory in a way. That Iacocca first appears in the book as this pro-free market, conservative Republican car magnate who is arguing with the Nixon administration against Ralph Naderite type regulations. And then in the Carter years, when Iacocca is head of Chrysler, he administers, or he kind of develops this idea of the bailout of Chrysler that Carter helps with, although Iacocca doesn't think it's generous enough. And so suddenly Iacocca, with his business struggling, and the car business was struggling from the development of competition from outside the U.S., especially from Japan, he sort of recognizes government sorry about that. He recognizes government as this potential benefactor in terms of both the ability to provide a bailout, but also to raise protectionist walls against Japanese car imports or imports from other places. And so he becomes much less free market. And then when he encounters Reagan, he's always pushing Reagan to do these non-free market things. And Reagan, even though Iacocca is a huge phenomenon, we talk about this book that he appears on Miami Vice. He writes this best-selling memoir that's the #1 bestseller 2 straight years, the same book, which is really astounding. And then when he goes and he argues to Reagan for some of these anti-free market things, including a gas tax, which again is really showing how the corporate interests are in bed with government interests, but not in the interests of the American people necessarily. Reagan pushes him aside and says, that's, we're not interested in that. He tells him why it's a bad idea from his pollster's perspective. And then he even belittles Iacocca, saying, that's why you're on this side of the desk and I'm on this side, meaning Reagan gets to be president and Iacocca is not. Even though there was a boomlet of Iacocca for president, they wasn't going to have.
Sorry, so again, I apologize for arguing my priors, but like, is there a story in here that, I mean, so like one of my great complaints, going back to Thomas Nast cartoons, right, is this idea that it's a vestigial Marxist argument that big business, because they are the ruling industrial classes and the owners of capital and all that stuff, that they are definitionally quote unquote right wing, right? And the idea that, I'm not saying that they're definitionally left wing. I'm just saying that like left wing and right wing don't really necessarily apply to the mission or skill sets of being the CEO of a very large economic concern, and that they tend to be much more pragmatic, let's say, one might even say cynical or opportunistic. And so the story you tell about Lee Iacocca is a perfect illustration of the sort of my longstanding point, which is that they are for free speech, they're for free trade when free trade is in their interest, and when free trade is not in their interest, they're not. They're free trade for thee, protectionism for me. They're against government subsidies when they help their competitors, but all of a sudden they find religion when they're helpful for them. And so this idea that there is a consistent ideological through line to being a captain of industry or something like that is just sort of nonsense. And so the counterpoint to that would be someone like Luce, who actually does take a position, or even Henry Ford to a certain extent, who does take a position. But are there really sort of clear examples of CEOs, and I'll make it a little more complicated, of publicly traded companies that they actually take a position that is contrary to the interests of their company because of politics?
So 2 points on that. So first of all, as you know, and your other listeners know, I was a government official for many years, including I worked in the labor department with Secretary Elaine Chao. And one of the first lessons she taught me is don't count on big business in the foxhole, because they will desert you if it gets hot or it gets problematic. So yes, I think big business is mostly focused on their interests. But I think we see this in the first Trump administration. A lot of the tech CEOs just felt it was necessary to denounce Trump all the time. And maybe that was a good business decision to some extent, especially because the tech workforces are so liberal. But at the same time, you had other tech CEOs like Zuckerberg or Musk, who recognized that there was some benefit to maintaining relations with the Trump White House, and they often got denounced for it. So the politics are very fraught right now and complicated. And so you might see a benefit to partnering with an unpopular administration, at least unpopular in your industry, because you can get more stuff done. And if Trump's going to go push tariffs, you don't want the tariffs on your company or your product. But at the same time, if it means that the liberal intelligentsia and the mainstream media is going to denounce you and your board gets uncomfortable, well, then that also is potentially problematic. So there is this real question of what's in the interest of your company. And that's why CEOs have this really complicated road to navigate, because the interest of your company may be a specific legislative proposal, but it may also be what they call today the vibes, right?
Mm-hmm.
How you're perceived in the mainstream media and with your board and in the sports.
So just sort of generally speaking, where do you come down? So there's, as you know, I'm a big believer that there are very few new ideas. There's just new marketing slogans for very old ideas, right? And so a lot of the what is it? Social, environmental,
ESG.
ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance stuff. The arguments swirling around that, are basically the same arguments that were swirling around Milton Friedman's stuff about corporate responsibility. Right? We just sort of we think that we can come up with a new label for these ideas that somehow that will change everything. Generally speaking, I mean, you do talks for corporate muckety mucks and all of that kind of thing. And if there's corporate muckety muck out there who wants to bring Tevi on board, you should reach out to him. But where would you advise people to draw a line between, we're not people, CEOs, right? Between taking a position in politics, on a politician, on a party, and just staying in your lane and keeping your mouth shut?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for mentioning 1600 lessons, my leadership training lessons camp for based on my knowledge of the presidency, which has a lot of great lessons, and I've gotten people who have reached out based on my appearances on Reddit, so I appreciate that. But in terms of drawing the line, my general approach is you got to be more careful, and if you take a political approach based on your own personal predilections, that's not going to be helpful to you or your company. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have the company take political positions that could potentially be beneficial. But I was impressed with Jamie Dimon when I read the book. And Jamie Dimon has this construction where he calls himself barely the Democrat. And those three words kind of convey a lot, because by saying Democrat, well, then the people on the left say, okay, he's one of us. But by saying barely a Democrat, it's suggesting that he's critical of the Democratic Party and the woke excesses in that. And so people on the right can say, okay, maybe he's a CEO we can deal with. So again, he's not out there banging the gong on his political positions on issue A or issue B, but he's saying, I want to work with both sides. And I think that's the smarter approach in this current environment.
Yeah, I got to say, I mean, I've heard a lot of big CEO types talk at various events and stuff. And Jamie Dimon is the most impressive because they're all politicians, right? At that level, we're talking about Fortune 50, Fortune 15 kind of companies. They have to be politicians to a certain extent, particularly when they're speaking to large audiences and that kind of stuff. And so I'm always less wowed than people who think they're getting the straight dope from a CEO in a big room kind of thing, even if it's off the record. That said, Jamie Dimon's next level compared to other CEOs in terms of his ability. I don't want to make it sound like I'm insulting him, because I'm not. But he provides a version of sincerity that is really, really persuasive. And which is not to say I think he's lying or he's fake or anything like that. But again, you have to be a performer at that level. And his performance comes off comfortable, authentic, persuasive in ways that particularly like tech CEO guys just aren't nearly, maybe because they grew up talking to so many nerds, are just not nearly as good at it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a story in the book about Zuckerberg appearing with Obama and how much he was sweating and how nervous he was, and Obama trying to calm him down. So that's their story. But look, what's the old joke? Sincerity, if you can fake that, you can fake anything.
Right.
I think J.D. Dimon is very good and very effective at what he does. And that's why, even though he's had his issues with Trump is talking about him as a potential Treasury Secretary. And if a Democrat came in, maybe they consider him as a potential Treasury Secretary. He's not gotten himself written off by either party, and that's hard to do these days.
So how is Trump's relationship with various CEOs?
I think it's a very interesting question, because on the one hand, Trump sees himself as a CEO, and I guess he was a CEO not of a Fortune 50 company, but of his real estate company. And so he sees them as his peers, so he likes being with them. He also likes lording it over them. Like there's also happened about his golf game and his hole-in-one that he was telling to all these corporate CEOs. So Trump has these relationships with CEOs, and he likes it. On the other hand, he recognizes that a lot of top leadership of big companies, they are into this ESG stuff, and a lot of the boards and leadership of these companies are increasingly liberal, and they're very critical. Companies are very critical of Trump. So he's had some pretty ugly, nasty fights with them, but that's not unusual for Trump, and he kind of thrives on it. He sort of likes ugly, nasty fights. So it's a mixed record, but a mixed record for a Republican is actually a deviation from where we've been in the past, where Reagan was largely led by almost all CEOs, and the Bush administration was seen as preferable to let's say the Obama administration. So I think we've got this era, and now with J.D. Vance, who's a pretty severe corporate critic on the ticket for the Republicans, you have this era where both the Democrats and the Republicans are seen as corporate critics. And again, it makes it harder for CEOs to navigate in this challenging part.
Yeah, I mean, we're recording this on the morning that the Harris campaign has let it be known that Tim Waltz is going to be the running mate. By the time this airs, this will feel very old news to people, but it's very fresh for us. And just on this point, I do think it's going to be kind of fascinating to see where on economic policy, when Waltz debates Vance, they actually disagree. Because the sort of NatCon, very corporatist view of economics is very similar to the sort of progressive, what is it? Tim Waltz said, it's quote, we're going to hear a lot in the next 90 or so days, that some people's socialism is other people's neighborliness. That's it'll be just interesting to see where they draw sharp distinctions. I know where they're going to draw sharp distinctions on defund the police, but like where they're going to draw sharp distinctions on business is going to be interesting and probably scary for a lot of CEOs.
It's been a recurring theme in the presidential and vice presidential debates that the Democrats bash corporations and the Republicans do it much less so, although Sarah Palin did in her vice presidential debate. But for the most part, the Republicans aren't bashing corporations in their debates. And when Vance and Walz go at it, if they indeed do have a debate, you're going to have two candidates who are both critics of big business. And I think it's going to almost be a race to see who criticizes corporations more between those two.
Yeah, so in this environment, what would you say to CEOs? I mean, again, it gets back to my question. Do you publicly stay out of politics and privately work the angles? Do you stay out of it entirely? Do you pick a side? Do you sort of do you fire? What's that? Was it Chesty Puller, the famous line from the Marine who says the great thing about being surrounded is you can fire in every direction. You just sort of take shots at both sides. Or is that just sort of a self-indulgent thing? I mean, the best thing would be is privately owned, right? Because then you can do whatever the hell you want.
You certainly don't want to take shots at both sides. What you have to be prepared is to absorb shots from both sides because you're more in a defensive posture when it comes to politics. But I think you don't want your company to be seen as a Democratic company or a Republican company. That doesn't mean you can't have executives who give money to candidates, and that doesn't mean you can't occasionally weigh in on certain issues. But you don't want to also be like the Heritage Foundation with its scorecard for who's nice and who's nasty. You have to do it much more strategically. So if there's a really big issue to, let's say, your labor force or your board or your industry, you can weigh in there. But you really don't want to be some kind of barometer of what is the appropriate list of policies to be taken at. I think that is a very dangerous place to be.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me everyone will forgive you if you're a CEO, if you're taking a position about a regulation that actually is inimical to your business model, right? Like that's your job, is to be a zealous defender. Where I think CEOs got themselves into a world of hurt was thinking that they needed to, at times at the behest of places like Axios and a lot of the business press, which I think has ill-served the business community by arguing that you have to take sides on all the culture war stuff, right? That you have to be, that young people care about this stuff so much that they're not going to buy your fizzy lifting drink or whatever unless you take a strong position on Palestine or on Black Lives Matter or whatever. And I honestly, I don't believe that that's really true, but you do get this bubble effect where CEOs live in this elite world where a lot of people tell them that stuff and they get out over their skis on culture war issues that don't serve their shareholders or their employees to be way out in front on.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I've got to cite Vivek Ramaswamy's first book about woke corporations, which before he went in a direction that neither of us like, I thought was an interesting book. And he makes this point that the companies were doing that as kind of a cover so that they would do ESG so that they would be attacked for their environmental stances or whether they violate environmental regulations. And it makes some sense as a strategy. Let's say ExxonMobil making a big deal about diversity so that you wouldn't criticize them for any gay violation. But I think the companies, A, took it too far, but B, there's a danger when you bring in an ESG group into your HR department that those ideas start to infect the whole company. And this guy, Charles Gasparino from Fox Business, has this new book out, which I want to read, Go Woke, Go Broke, where then it starts to affect every business decision, and it's not beneficial to the company. So I understand, don't approve, but I understand why some of the companies did this a couple of years ago. They thought it was basically a hedge against what I call selective enforcement, where the government can go after any company for a variety of reasons. So sometimes they choose to go after a specific CEO. And I talk about this in the Power of Money with Elon Musk, where Elon Musk was kind of made by the Democrats. Obama goes to visit SpaceX. Obama's green incentives lead to the rise of Tesla. But then Musk becomes a persona non grata to Democrats, A, because he flirted with Trump, B, because of his talk about free speech, C, because of his purchase of Twitter, now X. And he became a villain to the Democrats and was so often criticized that suddenly you saw these enforcement actions coming against him from the regulatory state. And the Wall Street Journal did a very interesting editorial on this, where they said, we doubt that there was a memo from the Biden administration saying, hey, let's see where we can go after Musk. But the signal from on high, from all the criticism from top-level Democrats, was that if you go after Musk as a corporate, as a government bureaucrat, then there really won't be any costs imposed upon you, and you might actually get praised for doing it.
Yeah, I was just looking. You do mention this book that I think they should do an updated reprint of, The Suicidal Corporation by Paul Weaver. My understanding, I believe it was in that book. It's been a long time. My understanding is that, I'm going to butcher this, but during the years of the Ford Pinto, right, unsafe at any speed, where Nader is doing all that stuff. The story is about this guy, Weaver, who was a Wall Street Journal editorial writer. He gets offered this job to go work for Ford, and he's going to put his like Friedrich Hayek loving free market stuff to work on the comms side, and in the lobbying side, and make arguments for the good of free market capitalism and all this kind of stuff. And what he discovered was that there is this sort of almost Nietzschean death wish, or Freudian death wish, among a lot of big corporations to like be loved. And they decide not to go fighting, making the arguments and fighting the fight against the Naderites and all that kind of stuff. Instead, they have this idea that they can just buy goodwill in Washington by funding Washington Week in Review on PBS. And like that will get all the regulators off of our back. And like the naivete and the weird sort of Aaron Sorkin logic that is required to think that like that's how Washington works, is that you can buy off your enemies by funding a PBS talk show, is really just kind of astounding, given how good like some of these companies are at like doing things like make cars, although maybe not in the 1970s.
Yeah, but also look how it cascades over the years. I mean, the Ford Foundation, which Henry Ford creates largely as a tax dodge, but also an effort to do philanthropic efforts to improve his name and reputation, is now this entity that is promoting all these, I think, very dangerous and divisive racial-based theories that are, I think, extremely problematic. And I think Ford would kind of spin over in his grave if he saw what the Ford Foundation was funding today.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, although I have to say, mostly by omission, this is the gentlest treatment that Henry Ford has gotten on this podcast in years, because Henry Ford was not a good guy.
No, indeed not, and an anti-Semite, and I make that very clear in the book. But also an interesting guy for talking about relationships with CEOs, because he had so many of them over such a long period, and he was such a celebrity. He was one of the most talked about people of the 1910s and the 1920s. So that's why I think he's worthy of studying the book.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, not to get the chocolate of my weak party shtick in the peanut butter of my corporatism shtick, but I just had recorded earlier this morning, a conversation with Jonathan Rauch, because he had this great piece in The Atlantic about the smoke-filled room is back, and all that. And as you know, I like smoke-filled rooms, literally and figuratively. And one of the points he makes is that back in the days when the parties actually were gatekeepers, Henry Ford wanted to run for president, and he went to both parties and said, let's make this happen. And they talked to him and like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that, and just said, screw off. And would that, the parties were that strong today, you wouldn't have had the CEO of Trump Industries or whatever taking over the Republican Party. But we do have to wrap up. But I got to ask, so like, one of my abiding peeves is this idea that what the country desperately just needs is, and this long predates Trump. This is another one of these old ideas that people think is a new idea. What the country just really needs is a businessman as president who runs the government like a business. And I think that this is one of these very seductive ideas that, de Tocqueville might call it a clear but false idea. It's very seductive and compelling when you think about it, until you realize, not to get all Oakshottian about enterprise associations versus, civic associations. The government's not a friggin' business, and the incentives of politics are not the same as the incentives of a business. And the skills you develop as a businessman do not necessarily lend themselves to your skills as a president. Where do you, now that I've told you where I come down on this, where do you come down on this? Will this idea ever die?
Well, the idea is never going to die, but you are generally correct. And I talk in the book about Jack Welch, who knew 10 presidents, and he was asked multiple times to be a cabinet secretary, and he would always say no. And one of his reasons was because I don't want to work for someone, meaning president. I'm used to being the CEO and in charge of things, but at the same time, I know that my skill set doesn't translate. I mean, he was known as Neutron Jack because he would get rid of divisions that were unprofitable. He would fire people, lay them off or whatever, because he thought it would help the company's bottom line. And you can't just do that. You can't go to the Department of Labor and say, okay, I'm going to get rid of the 5,000 most unproductive workers. You're not allowed to do that. You don't have the capacity to do it. So again, the skill sets that work in the business world don't always translate into the government world. It doesn't mean there are some skill sets. We talk about J.D. Dimon being a successful politician in many ways, but you can't run your company, you can't run the government or your agency if you're a cabinet secretary as you run business.
I mean, it's transparently obvious to me that Jamie Dimon would be more successful, I'm not saying successful, more successful as a president than, I don't know, Peter Thiel, right? Who, whatever you think about Peter Thiel, he doesn't have the gift for gab and, that kind of thing. Like Bill Gates would not be very good at being a president because he sounds like Kermit the Frog and he likes to talk about studies, and that's great for the head of the Gates Foundation, but it doesn't lend itself necessarily to being president of the United States. Any final words you want to leave us with on why we should all get the power and the money? We always forget that you do not mention the CEO of Montana Enterprises, who said that in this country you got to make the money first. Then when you get the money, you get the power, and then when you get the power, you get the women. any last parting thoughts for listeners about why they should get the power and the money? I'm just trying to prevent you from.
I think if people are convinced by now to get the power and money, I don't think any last words will do. But I do want to talk to you about this in the pre-show. I was just talking about the writing process a little bit.
Sure.
And just talking about how it's helpful, and I'm grateful to friends like you and Ben Sass, who I talk about in advance of writing the book, because I think that really helped shape the direction of the book. And Sass in particular told me that one of my skills as a writer for the Vision Out the fifth book I've written is I find a way to take a vast subject and delimit it. So what I do in Our Money is I talk about CEOs, but there's an infinite number of CEOs who have relationships with multiple presidents who you can compare and contrast. And that was a really helpful insight. Similarly, talking to you and getting these ideas about progressivism and culto. And I alluded to this earlier, you can get so much more from talking to a smart friend before you start writing than from just plopping the manuscript in their lap and asking them to correct something. And they will be nice, most of them, and they'll correct some grammatical mistakes, but they're not really, in most cases, going to change the trajectory of the book at that late hour. So it's much more helpful if you are ever writing a book to talk to smart people in advance. And I'm blessed to have friends like you and Sass and my brother Gil also helps in advance. And I think I'm grateful for that. And they shall put that out in these bells.
Yeah, so I've only written 3 books, so I got to catch up. But I learned from that process that it actually makes sense to find someone that you respect who would do it for you for free and still pay them. Because if you ask someone to do it as a favor, like, you're not going to get their full attention, and they're not going to like necessarily rake you over the coals and whatever. But like, most of the people we know that we respect at this level, this is not me dunning you to pay me next time to read a manuscript, but like I paid Kevin Williamson to, who has lots of other things to do with his life, to look at the manuscript of Suicide of the West, because I wanted to pay for his best effort and about how he thought about stuff. And I agree with you. It makes a lot of sense to talk to people beforehand, in part just to find out what to read, right? I mean, they're just people who've read a lot of things that you haven't read, and they know things that you don't know. And it just saves, as a heuristic, it's very, and I've joked about this before, I need a German word for the feeling you get when you read something that you wish you had read before you wrote your book. Because it's one of the most painful experiences of just like, oh crap, this would have been so useful, if I just read it before I wrote the book, and so I agree with you on all that.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it happens to me all the time. And I supplement my files with these new facts, but it's already after the horse is out of the barn, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it's infuriating at times. And like there was this great piece in National Affairs called, I'm going to butcher the title, but it's Liberalism in Theory, Liberalism in Practice, basically. Something like that. We'll put in the show notes. And it cut through so much of the stuff that I had struggled with writing that book, that I'm not saying it came out in a different place. It just it's like, oh crap, this is the Monarch notes for like this argument that I had to spend like 6 months reading about to figure out how to make. And so that's just, that's useful. I mean, I remember when you went off to grad school a long time ago, leaving me behind to deal with Ben on my own. You had somebody, I don't remember who it was, but somebody had given you the advice about when you're writing a dissertation, start writing. Like, don't procrastinate forever, because you'll take forever and you'll never get it done. Pick a date, read as much as you can before that date, but then on that date, start writing. And I think that's the other side of this advice, which is that you can research forever, literally, if you think you have to know every single thing in the world about your subject matter before you start writing. And that's a guaranteed way of never actually completing a book. So at some point, you just have to jump in and start swimming.
Yeah, it's a great point. And let me, I guess we got to go, but we'll close by citing some wisdom from Ben, which is this book took 4 years, and all my books take 3 or 4 years. I They don't put it out that often because it takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of research. And I remember once Ben and I were talking about someone who you will know, and I'm not going to mention on the podcast, but he wrote a lot of books, and he always complained that his books didn't get enough coverage. He had a book coming out every year or so. And Ben said to me privately that that guy's books would have twice as much influence if he wrote half as many of them.
For sure.
And I think it's a really good point. You just can't inundate people with a book every 6 months or every year. I mean, I guess if you're Daniel Silva and your fans expect your Gabriel
Novelists
Alone
can definitely
book,
do that, right? When you're a franchise novelist, you can definitely do that, but that's a different
and
thing.
they expect it.
Yeah.
But if you're writing the kinds of books we write that A, are trying to capture a particular moment, and B, require a lot of thought and research, you just can't be putting out a book every year because people aren't going to be paying attention.
Yeah. And also, I mean, we should do a separate podcast. Maybe we'll get a bunch of other people on and just do like how to write a book.
I would love that.
I once had my literary agent on in the early, like the first season of The Remnant. People really dug that. But one of the things I think that people need to grow. Well, like one of the pieces of advice I got early was if you don't change your mind about something, in the process of writing the book, you're writing the book wrong. Because you need to go into it with an open mind that some part of your thesis is wrong, and that's okay. And better to find out. No one wants to be Naomi Wolf and find out that the entire idea for the book was hot garbage in an interview with the BBC, right? I mean, so you want to find your problems early.
Get into that.
All right, my friend. Thank you so much for doing this. Obviously, we'll have you back. And we'll cut this out if you don't want this revealed, but you're on your way to Israel for the umpteenth time in recent years. You're going there for family reasons, and there'll be book talks and people can go find out about all that, but do stay safe. This is not the ideal moment to be going to Israel. We're recording this on August 6th, and I'm planning on doing a podcast with Walter Russell Mead tomorrow, where we think it might be at the outset of hostilities. So, I'm making light of it, but do stay safe.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And look, Israel is fighting a war that is a civilizational struggle that is for all of us. And I think I can't neglect the country and say, I'm not going to go there because it's dangerous. What am I going to say to my brother and his kids who live there all the time? Oh, it's too dangerous for you to live there. I can't do that, and I won't do that. And I'm going to continue to support Israel and continue to visit Israel, even if some people say to me, hey, are you not aware of that World War III thing or whatever else jokes they make to me? But I'm going to go there. I'm going to do a book on Jerusalem, and I will report back to you on the other side.
All right. Well, I want the whole Troy clan to stay safe. That's my point. I applaud your principled approach to this and all that, but stay safe.